Everyone had a few words that influenced them. Lee Hyun-sun had something like this. For example, when Lee Hyun-sun was an undergraduate, these were the words that he heard the most from his teacher. Everyone, be creative. Think about what other people can't. You must be able to break out of this place. At the time, Lee Hyun-sun had thought, so how do I do that? The demands of society were sudden for Lee Hyun-sun, who had been used to going to school, eating meals, and then going to sleep since childhood. So far, he had been told how to move, and now he was being forced to do something he had never done before. What was creativity? What was thinking about an idea that other people couldn't think of? Why did it suddenly become a world where he had to do something like this? Then, what had he been doing so far? Lee Hyun-sung wandered all throughout university and then naturally joined the army. I think you have the natural constitution to be a soldier. Please apply to be a senior officer. If he hadn't heard the administrator's words at that time, what would his life be like now? It was impossible to know. There was nothing he knew about the future he hadn't chose. In any case, he was a soldier, and he lived without regretting his choice. For a person who found society difficult, the army was relatively comfortable. The administrator congratulated Lee Hyun-sun for passing the senior officer's test and said, Ensign Lee, if you're not sure, then just follow what the manual says. Then at least people won't hold you responsible. He heard these words instead of the toast. The memory was as clear as the lunch he ate a week ago. However, if he could meet the administrator again, then he would ask one thing. Administrator, what should I do now? Lee Hyun-sun looked at the incoming sea of hell flames and bit his lips. I have no manual for cases like this. He thought it would be easier for him to call out the military creed as Lee Hyun-sung shouted, Jung Hee-won-shi, please regain your mind, please. Just as the service creed couldn't move the hearts of the soldiers, his voice didn't reach Jung Hee-won. He narrowly hid behind a building as the hell flames covered the ground and the incarnations burned painfully. Quack! Help me! Lee Hyun-sung couldn't save any of them. He looked at the deaths happening in front of his eyes and once again realized that the justice sleeping inside him was just a manual. Jung Hee-won's figure was approaching through the hazy heat. The Constellation Master of Steel is looking at you. Lee Hyun-sung received that silent gaze and bit his lips. Dogshashi, what should I do? Should he fight? Could he stop her? Lee Hyun-sung looked at the incoming Jung Hee-won and his fist shook. Lee Hyun-sung had no idea what the shaking meant, why he hesitated, and why he couldn't run away from this place. Maybe it wasn't the world that was hard. The difficult thing was Lee Hyun-sung himself. Dogshashi, please let me know the answer. Despite knowing it wasn't possible, Lee Hyun-sung prayed like a reservist, desperately hoping the training would be cancelled today due to the weather. Then, amazingly, he heard a voice he had been waiting for. Lee Hyun-sung-shi. He thought it was a joke. Can you hear me? However, it wasn't a joke. He looked around, but there was no source for the voice. In other words, the voice was heard in his head. Dogshashi. Was this the enemy's trap? Still, he was willing to believe it, even if it was the enemy's trick. Let's start thinking while running away. There are two ways. Lee Hyun-sung instinctively rose and ran. It wasn't a trap. There was only one person who would speak like this. Jung Hee-won was chasing behind him, but he wasn't afraid anymore. His breathing stabilized and he was ready to accept new commands. His muscles started to tense as his breathing became heavy. One method is to kill Jung Hee-won. It is a familiar choice. Kim Dokja had always been this way. It had been like this since the first time they met. He always released the safest and most brutal solution first. The party members themselves rejected it. The second method is to keep running away like this? That's right. Then we will do it the third way. Kim Dokja's solution was always the third answer. He was a person who always thought of the third situation. That's who Kim Dokja was. Thus, Lee Hyun-sung believed in him. However, Lee Hyun-sung-shi. This time, there is no third method. Of course, I had a third method. I just had to wait for the right time. Omniscient Reader's Viewpoint Stage 3 is activated. First-person supporting role viewpoint is currently incomplete. Jung Hee-won was using Hellflame's ignition. It was terrible even if the opponent was bad. Well, who would be different? Why are you always like this? Lee Hyung-sung cried out while breathing harshly. The first-person viewpoint meant that I could feel the heat of the flames. Jung Hee-won swung her sword like she intended to turn all of Seoul into a sea of fire. In fact, strictly speaking, the first and second methods I presented would have the same results. Lee Hyung-sung had to kill either Jung Hee-won or flee. If he left, Jung Hee-won would run out of magic power and die. In other words, one of them would die. This was the damn Nirvana scenario. Kill Hee-won-shi? You came to give me that advice? Jung Hee-won was approaching. It was different when they were allies, but now I knew for sure after she became an enemy. The Judge of Destruction, Jung Hee-won, was strong. Even if she didn't use Judgment Time, she was the owner of demon slaying. In addition, there was Uriel's Stigma, Hellflame's ignition. She was one of the strongest members of my party. It was almost impossible to suppress the berserk Jung Hee-won without killing him. I can't accept this method. What the hell was this courage? Lee Hyung-sung started running towards Jung Hee-won. Wait a minute, Lee Hyung-sung-shi. Jung Hee-won, wake up! Lee Hyung-sung kept running towards Jung Hee-won. He rushed as if he was angry for believing me. The country and the manual. Lee Hyung-sung's great mountain push and Jung Hee-won's Hellflame ignition clashed. However, the palms that could push a mountain found it hard to break through the Archangel's flames. His right arm soon started to melt from the pure white light. Jung Hee-won-shi! Lee Hyung-sung let out a pained and depressed cry. Lee Hyung-sung lost his right arm and reached out with his left arm. I cried out urgently. Lee Hyung-sung-shi, if you run away, then at least one of you can live. I don't want to. Nobody will blame you if you run away. I don't want to. Don't you think of me as a manual? Then please listen to me. I don't believe in such a manual. Lee Hyung-sung's answer was unexpected. At the same time, it was Lee Hyung-sung's answer. Everyone was contradictory. The person who followed the manual actually hated the manual more than anyone else. He was a creative person who was a mere subordinate to the system than anyone else. It was when he broke through this contradiction that his story would begin. I can't give up, even if the results aren't good. It doesn't matter if I die here. No matter how durable Lee Hyung-sung was, it was unreasonable for him to resist Hellflame's ignition that melted even Shin Yu-sung. His left arm and then his right leg started to melt. Nevertheless, Lee Hyung-sung resisted. Like a moth towards the flames, he tried to reach Jung Hee-won. He staggered as his right knee disappeared, and I told him, I see. You did well. Lee Hyung-sung didn't answer. I smiled bitterly. This is the third method. The third method wasn't something I could tell him. It was up to Lee Hyung-sung to decide for himself. I wasn't even convinced that it would work. Even so, I chose this path because I found the sad feelings that occurred in Lee Hyung-sung's mind the moment he saw Jung Hee-won. You found the path yourself, without the manual. Lee Hyung-sung laughed as he collapsed in the flames. Doksha-shi, thank you. I could feel the ecstasy that occurred in Lee Hyung-sung's body. It was an emotion that humans reached when they broke through the contradiction and received an answer from death. Perhaps this sensation was the reality that Nirvana wanted to reach. It would have been wonderful if Nirvana could have seen this. Jung Hee-won was the one infected, but it was Lee Hyung-sung who lived in the present more than anyone else. Thank you. It is starting now. This was the beginning of the story. It was up to the audience to determine the continuation of this story. There was one being watching Lee Hyung-sung with more delicate eyes than anyone else. Master of Steel, one of the most steadfast beings in the Starstream. I spoke slowly. When are you going to act? The constellation Master of Steel is listening to your words. The constellation Master of Steel, the Master of Orichalcum, the hardest planet in the universe, and the sponsor of Steel Sword Lee Hyung-sung. I cut to the chase. Give your incarnation a chance. The constellation Master of Steel is silent. I know your fears. You must be afraid of the probability. The constellation Master of Steel has closed his eyes. But when are you going to notice the nebula around you? Are you going to be daydreaming until the end of the scenario? Lee Hyung-sung had done enough. Now it was up to his sponsor. The constellation Master of Steel acknowledges the courage of Incarnation Lee Hyung-sung. The constellation Master of Steel says it isn't time yet. I had expected it. In fact, Lee Hyung-sung was too weak for the awakening. The Constellation Master of Steel thinks that the incarnation Lee Hyung-sung won't be able to handle his narrative. The narrative of Steel was hard and heavy. Lee Hyung-sung wouldn't be able to withstand it. Of course, if he was alone. I'll bear it with him. The Constellation Master of Steel is looking at you. The Master of Steel seemed to be thinking of something. A moment later, a message was heard. The Constellation Maritime War God has nodded. Then sparks filled the vicinity. The character Lee Hyung-sung is preparing for his attribute evolution. A narrative is required in order to evolve the attribute. The Constellation Master of Steel is putting the narrative to the test. The narrative, Proof of Steel, has begun. A torrent of silver light rose from Lee Hyung-sung's body. I looked at the brilliant light and was reminded of a scene from Ways of Survival. Who was it? A character asked Yoo Jung-hyuk a question. Why is Lee Hyung-sung called the Steel Sword? Ajashi doesn't use a sword. Lee Hyung-sung never used a sword at all in the original Ways of Survival. Even so, Lee Hyung-sung's nickname was Steel Sword. Lee Hyung-sung doesn't need a sword. Steel started to grow from the melted arms and leg of Lee Hyung-sung. Like scales, the steel grew to cover his whole body. Lee Hyung-sung's body changed into one big sword. The character Lee Hyung-sung has activated the stigma, Steel Transformation. A single sword that wouldn't break before any trial. If Yoo Jung-hyuk was here, then he would have said it clearly. That guy, he is the sword.